This video is not just about being a head-to-head comparison between the 9060 XT and the 5060 Ti to represent kind of mid-range GPUs. I already tested lower-end or budget GPUs in my previous video. I can probably link that in the video description. However, this will be performance comparisons against them, but I'll run through a lot of graphic settings, and I'll also give some thoughts on some visual choices. Because I will look at like RT off versus RT on, and there's actually pros and cons to both. It's not just about performance. And then I'm also going to look at path tracing versus ray tracing versus RT off. Although unfortunately path tracing is locked to just NVIDIA GPUs. I don't like that. This is also an NVIDIA sponsored game, and that seems a little bit like, Anyway, so don't like that, but anyway, we will be looking at all of those things. So you could think of this as a bit of a settings guide when it comes to the visuals and performance, but also you can get the head-to-head comparison on these GPUs. And the good news is overall the game is quite performant. So let's go ahead and play the footage. On the left, you have the 9060 XT 16GB. On the right, you have the 5060 Ti 16GB. Heads up that if you tried the 8GB versions of these cards, you'd want to mostly stick to like the balanced graphics preset. Now here we're getting good performance. You can see a little bit of visual noise in the floor though on those reflections. That what I mean about RT on isn't always better. This is the maximum graphics preset, which is called quality, and it does include ray tracing by default. This is native 1080p. You can see also some visual noise on the metal floor grates here as well, and that's again caused by the ray tracing. Also, you'll notice as we go into this more open environment that performance overall drops. Now, it's still high. We're still in like the mid 80s on the AMD card and kind of upper 80s to low 90s on the NVIDIA card. Still good performance overall, but notice the enclosed sections perform a lot better than the open sections, which is why I designed a benchmark run to include both. So by the end of this run, we're seeing that at the maximum graphics preset, individual settings like path tracing can be turned higher manually, but this is the highest preset at native 1080p. 107 FPS average versus 110. 1% lows were lower, but still high. And this open area does drop performance, but still has good performance. So overall, good stuff. Let's go ahead and switch to RT off. So this is otherwise identical. 1080p native resolution. We're still on the graphics preset labeled quality, which is the maximum preset available. However, that preset turns RT on by default. I'm now turning it off. One thing here is we can see how they perform, because sometimes NVIDIA has a ray tracing lead, etc. But also you can get an idea of what the visuals look like. Later we'll look at RT on versus RT off as a side-by-side, but here you're seeing both cards with RT off. Now, you can see that overall average performance did increase on both cards, but not wildly so. Our average result by the end of the benchmark run is 117 versus 119. You'll see that we're seeing less reflections on the floor here than we did before, but it's also less visually noisy. Anyway, the 5060 Ti has a 2% lead here. So in other words, like RT on or RT off, the cards have about the same performance gap. So in other words, NVIDIA doesn't seem to have an RT performance advantage in this game, and this seems to be a really light RT implementation. My guess would be kind of designed around consoles, which don't have a lot of RT performance, which is probably also why it's a little bit visually noisy, because they're going with probably a low ray count and probably a pretty lightweight denoiser. Anyway, you can see the city here is now even around 100 FPS, and overall performance is quite good. So what are we going to look at next? So I need to stop here and make sure you notice something. Both sides of the screen are now the 5060 Ti. One reason why I'm doing that is because now I want to look at RT on versus RT off as our side-by-side comparison. Now you can notice performance-wise, turning ray tracing off only gains 8% performance. Now 8% isn't nothing. It also can reduce the VRAM consumption a little bit if you're on a card that only has 8 gigabytes of VRAM or something like that. But raw performance-wise, yeah, it's only 8% difference to turn RT off. So you might want to think about not just that performance difference, but the visual difference. So as we go through here, I'll note some things that I noticed during gameplay. So one thing is, I'll pause it here. This is more noticeable in motion, so I'll let it play again in a second. But I want you to look at the floor here compared to the floor here. Now here, there are fewer reflections on the floor, which you could view as a visual downgrade. However, there's kind of chunky noise that happens in these reflections on this floor. So that I would view as worse visuals in that element, meaning there's pros and cons. Also, while this game does feature ray reconstruction, in the path tracing mode, the normal RT mode does not allow you to enable ray reconstruction, which I think isn't ideal. I would imagine we would get a cleaner looking image if you could enable ray reconstruction here, even if it reduced performance. So that's some thoughts on it. Now I'll let it play, and again, look at the floor here versus the floor here. So you lose some reflections, but the reflections on the left are kind of noisy and not super detailed. So this could be a personal preference thing, because there's not a huge performance difference between the two settings. Again, as we turn the corner here, look at the grading on the floor. Like right here versus right here. Again, they're trying to add in more reflections on these like grading pieces of metal, which you could view as a good thing. However, even though there's less reflections here, there's less visual noise. This looks really garbled. So I'm gonna kind of like slide myself out of the way. And I'll let that play, and you can see, again, that there's kind of that, in my opinion, distracting noise on the left, even if you are getting more reflections overall. So I'm just presenting the data to you. I know that different people are bothered by different things in images. Personally, I'm extremely bothered by noise in the visuals. So oftentimes I would prefer visuals that are technically less detailed or missing reflections, but are more consistent and stable, because it just doesn't break my immersion as much. Now what are we looking at? So on the left, we now have ray tracing on, as before. So the left is the same thing. It's also the 5060 Ti on both sides of the screen, but the right is now path tracing. I also just noticed a typo, and I'm not redoing this whole video edit just for this. So that's not RT off, that's path tracing on. So view this as left-hand side of the screen is the first one, right-hand side of the screen is the second one, and I apologize for that. I know that's bad, sorry. I don't have time to redo this video, so if you want the video today, this is how it's gonna be. Anyway, so RT on the left, path tracing on the right, but it's also not quite an apples to apples comparison. For path tracing to be at all usable, I had to go to DLSS balanced, which on a 1080p output is pretty aggressive upscaling. And so you will notice a softness and a certain lack of detail on the right compared to the left, because the left is actually native TAA. The right also uses ray reconstruction, so DLSS and ray reconstruction are automatically enabled and forced to be used when you're using path tracing. That being said, DLSS could be set to DLAA, which would be native resolution, but if I did that, it would be kind of not usable frame rates. So what we're looking at here is not an apples to apples comparison, it's more of a visual comparison where I could play at native 1080p with RT on the left, so I'm looking at that option. But if I wanted to use path tracing on this class of GPU, I would have to use aggressive upscaling, and I still don't reach the same performance. So native resolution with ray tracing on is 67% faster than path tracing mode but using DLSS balanced. That's what we're seeing. But now let's look at the visual differences between the two. So the left certainly has more detail, but also notice that the left has that visual noise I was talking about where it's consistent here, I think thanks to two things, ray reconstruction being a better denoiser, but also thanks to it's probably running more rays per pixel, which is also more costly, which is why performance is lower. Also, things like the reflections in the glass and all of that just simply have a lot more detail, and more things are reflected and with just much more accuracy and detail on the right-hand side of the screen. Also, things like the shadows get improved with path tracing, so it's not just reflections. Path tracing improves some of the lighting and shadows and things like that as well. But the reflections are very noticeable, and it improves the visual noise. So I would say here that on the right, you have less performance and less detail. There's certainly a more blurriness to the image. However, it is less distracting noise, like look at the floor grading here, and just overall the anti-aliasing is better as well than the native TAA is. So there's pros and cons to both choices. Now, in the more open environment that's more demanding, the path tracing with DLSS balance drops to the upper 50s, which I would say is still very playable in a single player game. And personally, I'd probably kick on like ×2 frame gen because you're at a high enough base frame rate to use it. So I would say that both of these could make sense to use depending on personal preferences. And it's kind of cool that you could at least reach a decent path tracing experience if you wanted to use it on a card like the 5060 Ti, albeit this is still 1080p. We will look at 1440p later. Next up, what we have is still path tracing on the right, still DLSS balance, so the right hasn't changed. The left is now RT off, but still at that quality, otherwise max preset. So this is for people who are thinking about, okay, I don't like the visual noise in ray tracing, so should I turn RT off or should I go to path tracing? So that is what we're looking at here. And man, I still screwed up still same typo. So view this as frame rate on the left, on top, frame rate on the right, on the bottom. It's not RT on versus RT off. Geez, this is RT off on top actually, and path tracing on the bottom. I do apologize again. If you want the video today though, this is how it's gonna be. Sorry for the typos. Anyway, we can still look at the visual head-to-head. So now you're not seeing as much of that noise on the left because we turned RT off, but you're also just missing a bunch of reflections. Like look at the reflections in the glass here compared to the glass here. So like RT mode gets you way more reflections, gets you more accurate shadows. You get a lot, but performance-wise, left-hand side is 80% faster, despite running at native resolution and the right relying on DLSS balanced. Now, that being said, if you get enough performance here, it could be okay. But like I said, the main downside image quality-wise to the right is by relying on DLSS balanced on a 1080p output, like I said, you just lose some detail in certain objects. So the right-hand side looks a little bit soft, a little bit blurry, and some people are gonna be more bothered by that than anything else. So I could see people preferring not to do that. But other people would take the softer image in order to get the additional ray tracing effects from the path tracing mode. Like you probably just saw some big differences through that hallway on like the metal on the left and the right. As we come through here, you'll see some big differences on the reflections in like the vehicle windows, in the puddles, all sorts of stuff. And also with RT off, the screen space reflections also are a little bit noisy looking themselves. So anyway, like I said, there's pros and cons to both. Some people won't like the softness to the image on the right. So what are we looking at now? So we're back to 9060 XT on the left, 5060 Ti on the right. But now we're just looking at the balanced graphics preset. It's not balanced upscaling. The naming for the presets in this game are quality, balanced, and performance, which is sort of confusing because people use that for upscaling modes. So to be clear, we're talking about the graphics preset that is one notch down from the maximum, which is called quality. This graphics preset is called balanced, and it automatically turns off ray tracing. I'm still at native 1080p using TAA on both sides though. So this mode is also better suited to like 8GB graphics cards. So this is probably the way you would want to go if you're on an 8GB card. I know VRAM allocation shows over 8GB here, but when I actually played on an 8GB card, I did run into problems at the higher presets, especially with ray tracing on, but this mode actually worked out okay. It also still looks pretty good, and with RT off, you do lose out, like I said, on some reflections and things, but you're also like cleaning up a little bit of the noise. And overall performance is very high. Here we're getting 125 versus 128, so they're basically tied. And even in this more open area, both GPUs are actually usually over 100 frames per second. Even the 1% lows are in the mid-90s, so very smooth experience performance-wise here. Now, what are we looking at next? This is now switching to 1440p resolution, native TAA, and we're back to the maximum graphics preset, which does include ray tracing, but of course not path tracing, which we can't use on AMD, which is frustrating, but I've already said that. So anyway, let's keep playing. So 1440p native TAA, quality preset with RT. In the more enclosed environments, we're getting in the mid-80s. Also, I do want to mention that while the RT mode still has some visual noise, at 1440p, there's less noise because you get just more rays because there's more pixels. So it is still noisy, but I will say that the RT noise, I feel like, is reduced the higher render resolution you're at. So if you're on 1440p or 4K, you might have fewer issues with the visual noise, but like there's definitely still visual noise happening here. So it's not gone, but it's less, I think, than at 1080p. So now as we come out into this open area, we can see that performance does reduce, but it still stays pretty good. It mostly stays kind of in the mid 60 FPS range and at least stays over 60 FPS for the most part. 1% lows are slightly under 60. So this is a pretty good single player frame rate if you just want to play at the maximum preset at native 1440p on either of these cards. Now, that being said, you could turn on upscaling. This game does support FSR 4. So we've got FSR versus DLSS, and it is FSR 4, and visually I think it looks pretty good. Except with how it interacts with RT. So this is still the quality preset with RT enabled, but now we're upscaling to reach our 1440p output, and performance does jump considerably. However, because I think they're running a certain number of rays per pixel based on the internal rendering resolution, do you guys feel like the visual noise is worse now? I do. And so I think that the problem with using upscaling with the ray tracing in this game is you already have very few rays per pixel. Watch the metal grating here. I think this also looks very distracting in that visual noise. So I think that the ray tracing noise gets noticeably worse as you lower the internal rendering resolution. So I think if you have ray tracing enabled, you should actually try to play at native resolution. And if you have RT off, it's actually less bad to use upscaling, which, is kind of annoying because usually with RT on, you'd want to upscale to get some performance back, but I think it does increase the visual noise. Now, speaking of RT off, how about we just try turning RT off? So this is 1440p native still, so back to native, I guess I should say. And this is the quality preset, except I've turned the ray tracing off. So both GPUs are getting a little bit better performance now, and we have the usual trade-off, which is, some of the visual noise is reduced, but we are also now missing some of those reflections and things. But, as we turn this corner, you look at this like grating in the floor and things like that, it does, to me, look a lot more stable than what we were seeing before. Overall performance in the, enclosed area was quite high. Let's see how we do as we get out into the more open environment. So as we jump down into the more open environment, we see performance is actually still pretty solid for a single player game, kind of in the low 70s to mid 70s. NVIDIA GPU is a little bit ahead here, but low single digit performance advantage for the 5060 Ti, so nothing to worry too much about. Now, what if we turn on upscaling, but without ray tracing? So that's what we're looking at here. So we're on FSR and DLSS balance, but staying at the quality preset, except still with the ray tracing off. Now notice that you're not getting that increase to the visual noise that you got when you used upscaling with ray tracing enabled, because you're not running into that lower rays per pixel issue. So like as we go through the grating in the floor here, like upscalers, can have issues with that, but it's not nearly as bad as what we saw when we did this with RT enabled, with upscaling enabled. So interesting. So in other words, if you're shooting for high performance and you want to use upscaling, I think it might look nicer with RT off, as my personal preference there. But like I said, not everybody's as bothered by the visual noise. Speaking of the visuals, I think both FSR4 and DLSS are looking quite good here. So I think both of them put out a good output image and good performance. So there you go. So now what are we looking at now? So this is path tracing at 1440p, which I can't really do a AMD versus NVIDIA comparison. So path tracing at 1440p on a 5060 Ti. I had to go all the way to DLSS performance mode in order to get something that's playable. Now, in the more enclosed environments, you are able to be at around 60 FPS. Now, using the performance mode upscaling does get, it's a bit of a soft image. but it looks okay. And like I said, you get all those increases to the ray traced reflections, and you're not getting the noisiness to the image. I do notice a little bit of boiling, like on walls and things when I stand still, when I'm upscaling a lot using the path tracing mode, but not nearly as noisy as we got on the other modes. That being said, as we jump out into the city environment, kind of dips into the mid to upper 40s, which isn't amazing. It's not the worst base frame rate from which to use frame generation in a single player game. So I think if you're on a 1440p display on a card like a 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte version, you don't want to use the 8 gigabyte for the path tracing mode, you might consider the path tracing mode. You might try it out at DLSS performance with like ×2 or 3 frame gen and see how you like it. Some people I think will find it too soft, and some people will be okay with it and like the visuals that they get. So I think that'll be a bit of a personal preference thing. So overall, I think that's good for this particular video because, reminder, there's a bit of a weird like embargo thing going on where they say Capcom, when they gave people review access, they mentioned that the total length of captured gameplay used in reviews should be 10 minutes or less. And it's unclear to me whether the fact that my footage is just repeating the same thing over and over again means I have an exception or not. So you can see that the footage I've been playing to you fit exactly under 10 minutes. This was 9 minutes and 56 seconds of footage, just to be sure I'm okay. Now, like I said, I've already tested out some budget graphics cards in a separate video, so you could take a look at that. I'll probably remember to link it in a comment or video description. But also, I do still have upcoming content. I've also tested out a 9070 XT versus a 5070 Ti at 1440p and 4K resolution. And speaking of 4K resolution, I have also tested out a 5090. But that stuff will probably have to wait for a future video. Now, the game will release in a few hours, so my next video, if I want to, could probably include both the 5090 and the 9070 XT and 5070 Ti video, so I could kind of do a high-end PC in Pragmata video, where now we've done low-end first, and now we've done the mid-range, which was this video, so we can kind of do a high-end video. So one more video at least incoming, unless I split that and it becomes two. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section. The game is unlocking on Steam here pretty soon, so you'll be able to try it out for yourself. My overall thoughts is it is pretty well optimized performance-wise. Those open areas do perform worse than like what you saw in the demo if you played in the demo, but overall there's not a lot of stutter. The game performs pretty well, and one of my biggest complaints is the vendor lock on the path tracing mode, and one of my other big complaints is just that ray tracing setting. I think they should allow some other denoiser like ray reconstruction, or potentially allow a higher RT setting that isn't path tracing that just turns it up to more rays per pixel with an increased performance cost, but I would probably reduce some of that visual noise. So those are some of my thoughts. And just overall, if you're on an 8 gigabyte GPU, probably stick to the balanced graphics preset. Whereas if you have more than 8 gigabytes, you're okay trying out like the more advanced preset with ray tracing or path tracing. And I talked about all those trade-offs, so I think you guys get the idea. A lot of this is going to be personal preference, even if your GPU has the performance there. Hope all of you guys enjoyed the video and have an excellent day.